Julia Roberts did not merely become a movie star. She became the smile America trusted when the world felt uncertain. As Vivian Ward in Pretty Woman, she turned vulnerability into radiance. As Erin Brockovich, she transformed defiance into Oscar-winning power and became the first actress paid $20 million for a single film. Yet behind that familiar smile stood a childhood home divided by separation. A father lost when she was only 10, relationships exposed beneath relentless public scrutiny, and a wedding canceled days before the vows. Fame gave Julia wealth, influence, and a place among Hollywood's most enduring icons. It could not shield the life waiting beyond the spotlight. How did the girl who lost the security of one home become a woman who spent decades protecting another from the price of fame? And what did that protection ultimately cost her? If Julia Roberts' story has ever touched your heart, leave a like as we honor the life behind the smile America thought it knew. At 4 years old, Julia Roberts learned that a house could remain standing even after the life inside it had begun to separate. Born Julia Fiona Roberts on October 28, 1967, in Atlanta, and raised in Smyrna, Georgia, she entered a family shaped by performance, idealism, and growing financial pressure. Her parents, Walter Grady Roberts and Betty Lou Bredimus, were actors who created a children's acting workshop that welcomed both black and white students during a period when much of the American South remained deeply divided. Among the families who trusted them were Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King. Years later, Julia confirmed an extraordinary act of kindness connected to that relationship. The King family paid for my hospital bill. Before Julia became one of the most recognized women in America, her life had already been touched by a family whose courage helped change the country. The story revealed something important about Walter and Betty Lou. They believed art could create a room in which children from different backgrounds were treated equally. They offered performances as a place of imagination and connection, even while their own financial difficulties were becoming harder to contain. The workshop eventually closed, and the marriage weakened beneath pressures that affection and artistic ambition could not overcome. Julia's brother Eric later described the relationship between their parents as very emotional, very loud. In 1971, Walter and Betty Lou separated. Julia was only 4 years old. The separation changed the shape of her childhood. Her father remained someone she loved, but he was no longer part of the ordinary rhythm of every day. The distance between a child and a parent cannot be measured only in miles. It is also measured in breakfasts missed, questions saved for later, and moments that pass before anyone realizes they cannot be repeated. Julia was too young to understand all the reasons her parents could no longer remain together. She was old enough to feel that the security of the family she had known was no longer certain. Her mother later remarried, and family life remained complicated. Financial pressure continued, while the Roberts children grew up within relationships that carried unresolved tension. Julia was not yet the confident woman audiences would one day associate with a fearless laugh and an unmistakable screen presence. She was a child trying to understand where she belonged inside a family whose shape kept changing. The performing arts were already part of her inheritance, though no one could have known how far that inheritance would carry her. Her parents had taught children to step into characters, speak before others, and imagine lives beyond their own. Julia was still years away from discovering that the same world might one day give her a language for feelings she had not yet learned to name. The most permanent loss came in 1977. Walter Roberts died from throat cancer when Julia was 10 years old. The separation of her parents had created distance. His death made that distance impossible to cross. There would be no later reunion in which every unfinished question could finally be answered. There would be no adult conversation in which Julia could tell him what his influence had become. The father who had helped create a place for children to perform would never sit in a theater and watch his youngest daughter command a screen. He would never see the smile audiences would come to recognize around the world. Hear her name announced at the Academy Awards, or witness the career built from the artistic world he and Betty Lou had once tried to sustain. That absence gives the triumphs that followed a quieter meaning. Julia did not grow into fame under the steady gaze of the father, whose love of performance had shaped the family. She carried his influence into rooms he would never enter. When she eventually found her place before a camera, she was continuing a story that had begun long before Hollywood knew her name. In a small acting school created by two parents who believed art could bring people together. Years later, audiences would praise Julia Roberts for the emotional openness of her performances. She could make joy feel spontaneous, disappointment feel immediate, and grief appear in the silence before a character spoke. Those abilities cannot be reduced to childhood loss, and pain alone did not create her talent. Yet the girl who had watched her family change and lost her father at 10 understood that affection, security, and time could never be treated as permanent promises. That knowledge gave weight to the warmth she later brought to the screen. Walter Roberts died before he could know how widely his daughter's voice would travel. He never saw Mystic Pizza, Pretty Woman, Steel Magnolias, or Erin Brockovich. He never watched the world rise to honor her. But the life he had devoted to performance did not disappear with him. It continued through the daughter, who grew from an uncertain child in Georgia into a woman capable of making millions laugh, grieve, and believe her. The father who once opened a stage to children would not live to see Julia stand at the center of one. She carried part of him there all the same. In 1985, the year she turned 18, Julia Roberts followed her older siblings to New York and began looking for a place in industry that had given her no reason to expect one. She registered with a modeling agency, attended auditions, and waited for the small opportunities that often decide whether an unknown performer is allowed to continue. Her confidence was far from complete. Years later, Julia admitted that insecurity could be crippling, a revealing confession from a woman whose smile would eventually seem effortless to millions. Before the awards and magazine covers, she was a young actress entering rooms where strangers measured her face, voice, and presence within minutes. Rejection was part of the work. So was returning after it. Early appearances offered experience rather than certainty. A commercial placed her briefly before a camera, while a small role in the television series Crime Story in 1987 gave her another chance to be seen. Her brother Eric Roberts was already established, but his career could not guarantee hers. Julia still had to prove that she possessed more than a familiar surname or a striking appearance. She was learning how little control a young actor has over the decisions that shape a career. A scene could be shortened, a role could disappear. An audition that felt promising could end without explanation. The uncertainty deepened the insecurity she already carried, but it also forced her to develop a quality that would become essential throughout her life. The ability to keep working without knowing whether recognition would follow. The first major change arrived with Mystic Pizza in 1988. As Daisy Araujo, Julia brought impatience, humor, pride, and emotional volatility to a young woman who wanted a larger life but had not yet learned what it might cost. The role did not ask Julia to appear polished or protected. It allowed her to be impulsive, wounded, ambitious, and alive. Roger Ebert noticed the force of her presence, describing her as a young actress with the energy of a major star. His response captured what the film revealed. When Julia entered a scene, the camera seemed to understand that someone important had arrived before Hollywood fully did. That recognition did not make the next step gentle. In 1989, Steel Magnolias placed Julia beside Sally Field, Shirley MacLaine, Olympia Dukakis, Dolly Parton, and Daryl Hannah, women with far more experience and authority within the industry. Julia was the young member of the central cast, playing Shelby, a daughter determined to make her own cheeses while living beneath the shadow of serious illness. The role required joy and fear to exist in the same face. Shelby could be radiant in one moment and painfully vulnerable in the next. For Julia, the emotional demands of the character were intensified by a production environment that was not always supportive. Sally Field later recalled that the women rallied around Julia because she was young and because director Herbert Ross was particularly hard on her. The situation placed Julia in a familiar emotional position. She was being asked to prove that she deserved to remain in a room filled with people who had already established their place. Yet the pressure did not diminish her performance. She gave Shelby a warmth that made the character's suffering more painful, because audiences first experienced how fiercely she wanted to live. Her grief did not appear as performance alone. It emerged through a young woman resisting the limits placed upon her. At 22, Julia won the Golden Globe for Best Supporting Actress and received her first Academy Award nomination. The recognition marked a remarkable change in only a few years. The actress, who had entered New York uncertain of whether she would be noticed, was now being honored for making an audience feel the full weight of a daughter's hope, defiance, and vulnerability. The award did not prove that insecurity had disappeared. Julia would continue to speak about doubt long after fame arrived. What changed was that doubt no longer had the authority to remove her from the room. Mystic Pizza revealed her fire. Steel Magnolias revealed the emotional depth beneath it. Together, the films transformed Julia from a young actress searching for an opportunity into a performer Hollywood could no longer easily overlook. Her earliest victory was not that every door finally opened. It was that after enough doors remained closed, she was still present when the right one did. On Friday, Julia Roberts had the role that could change her life. By Monday, she had no job. In 1989, the young actress had been cast in a dark drama called 3000, only for Vestron Pictures to collapse over the weekend. Julia later remembered it with painful simplicity. This small movie company folded over the weekend, and by Monday, I didn't have a job. Disney eventually rescued the project and reshaped it into Pretty Woman. Yet Julia's place remained fragile. She had to prove herself again, as though every uncertainty that came before had returned to the room. Richard Gere was still unsure about playing Edward Lewis, until Julia slid him a note that read, "Please say yes." Gere later recalled telling the director, "I think I just said yes." The moment looked charming, almost playful, but beneath it stood a woman who understood how quickly a professional future could disappear. Then the camera found what uncertainty had failed to erase. The wide smile that would soon become unmistakable. A laugh so spontaneous that Gary Marshall sometimes surprised it out of her. And a vulnerability that made Vivian feel less like a fantasy than a woman fighting to be seen. The red dress became an image the world would never forget. The film made Julia an international star. Yet her reported $300,000 salary also revealed how little power she still held, beside an established male lead. Pretty Woman gave audiences a modern fairy tale. For Julia, it marked the moment millions began to claim a piece of her private self. Fame opened doors and made privacy harder to preserve. Her engagement to Dylan McDermott ended as her public life accelerated, turning an intimate loss into another subject for headlines. Julia also refused to remain trapped inside Vivian Ward. Sleeping with the enemy placed her within a story of fear and control. Dying young demanded tenderness beneath the shadow of illness. Hook surrounded her with spectacle while expectation followed her into every frame. I Love Trouble brought reports of tension during production, but she completed the work. These years were not a smooth ascent. Julia was trying to prove that the actress behind Pretty Woman could not be reduced to one smile, one romance, or one kind of role. My Best Friend's Wedding later allowed her to be selfish, wounded, desperate, and unmistakably human. Notting Hill placed her inside a story that echoed one of the central tensions of her own public life. A woman recognized almost everywhere, yet longing for a place where recognition did not matter. Runaway Bride reunited her with Richard Gere and revived the warmth audiences remembered. But Julia was no longer the uncertain newcomer who had once written, "Please say yes." She had been praised, judged, overexposed, and tested. Success had not removed doubt. It had taught her how to continue working while doubt remained. In 2000, Erin Brockovich completed the transformation. The role stripped away the protective glow of romantic comedy and gave Julia a woman powered by nerve, intelligence, exhaustion, and refusal. She became the first actress widely reported to receive $20 million for a film, turning the imbalance that had shadowed Pretty Woman into a public measure of how far she had come. In 2001, she won the Academy Award for Best Actress. The woman who had lost a career-changing role between Friday and Monday was now standing on the highest stage in her profession. The young actress who once needed one man to say yes no longer needed permission to belong. Julia had survived professional uncertainty, public heartbreak, the loss of privacy, and years of doubt without allowing them to define the final version of her career. Pretty Woman made the world look at her. Erin Brockovich made the industry reckon with her value. Somewhere between a small handwritten note and the Oscar placed in her hands, Julia Roberts stopped asking whether Hollywood had room for her. She had become one of the people capable of changing the room itself. Before the canceled wedding with Kiefer Sutherland became one of the most public heartbreaks of Julia Roberts' early life, she had already begun to understand how quickly fame could enter a private relationship. In 1987, after working with Liam Neeson on Satisfaction, Julia was reportedly involved in a brief relationship with the older actor. Public information about their time together remains limited, and the connection ended without becoming a major public chapter in either life. It belonged to the period before Julia became one of the most recognizable women in America, when her career was still uncertain and much of her personal life could remain beyond constant attention. Her relationship with Dylan McDermott became more serious. They met while working on Steel Magnolias in 1988, and reports later described them as engaged. Their relationship developed just as Julia's career was accelerating. Within a short period, Pretty Woman transformed her from a promising young actress into an international star. The change brought opportunities she had spent years seeking, but it also placed her private life under a level of attention she had never experienced before. The engagement became part of the public story surrounding her. Photographs, interviews, and speculation turned a personal commitment into material for strangers to examine. Julia later described the cost of celebrity with unusual clarity. "I don't think I realized that the cost of fame is that it's open season on every moment of your life." The statement reached beyond one relationship. It described the new reality surrounding her. Professional success no longer stopped when she left a film set. The relationship with Dylan ended before marriage. Public accounts do not provide one definitive explanation, and the timing alone cannot establish why two people separated. What it did reveal was how little control Julia now possessed over the way her private experiences were presented. A relationship could end between two people, yet the questions, interpretations, and headlines continued outside it. By the time Kiefer Sutherland entered her life, Julia was no longer discovering fame only through premieres and career opportunities. She had begun to see its effect on intimacy. The world that celebrated her smile also expected access to the woman behind it. That pressure would become far greater when her next engagement moved toward an altar before millions of strangers. 3 days before Julia Roberts was expected to marry Kiefer Sutherland, the future Hollywood had already written for her suddenly disappeared. In 1990, at 22, Pretty Woman had made her one of the most recognizable women in America. That same year, she met Kiefer Sutherland while filming Flatliners. Their relationship became serious quickly, and they were engaged by August. A wedding was scheduled for June 14, 1991. More than 500 guests were invited, and a studio soundstage was being prepared for a ceremony large enough to resemble another Hollywood production. What began as a promise between two people had become an event the public expected to witness. As the wedding approached, newspapers and tabloids published conflicting stories about the relationship. Some reports linked Kiefer to another woman, while other accounts focused on the pressure surrounding the ceremony itself. No single public explanation was confirmed by both Julia and Kiefer, and the full reasons remained private. What the public did know was that the wedding would not proceed. On June 11, 3 days before the ceremony, Julia's publicist announced that the wedding had been postponed by mutual consent. The soundstage would remain empty. Hundreds of guests would not arrive. The vows expected on June 14 would never be spoken. For a young woman whose face had become familiar across America, one of the most personal decisions of her life unfolded beneath relentless public attention. Years later, Kiefer spoke about the relationship with tenderness rather than accusation. He said they had been very much in love, but acknowledged that the wedding had become so enormous that it began to overtake them. He also praised Julia for having the courage to say, "I can't do this." The sentence ended a ceremony the public expected, but preserved Julia's right to decide the life she was about to enter. The cancellation did not bring privacy. Headlines continued, explanations multiplied, and strangers tried to assign blame to a decision whose complete meaning belonged to the two people involved. Julia did not provide the public with every answer. Over time, she began drawing a clearer line around her personal life, later describing the separation simply: one is private and one is public. Her films from that period were often reinterpreted through the broken engagement, though Sleeping with the Enemy and Dying Young had already been completed. The end of the relationship did not create the vulnerability audiences saw in those performances. It changed the way the public looked at the woman playing them. Julia was no longer only the actress whose smile had made Pretty Woman a phenomenon. She had become a young woman whose private future had vanished in front of millions. The wedding never happened. The soundstage would never host the ceremony. The guests changed their plans, and Hollywood moved toward its next story. Julia carried the consequences beyond the headlines. She had stepped away from a marriage only days before the vows, while the country was waiting for her to continue. Whatever remained private between her and Kiefer, one fact endured. At the moment when public expectation was greatest, Julia chose not to surrender the final decision about her own life. After the canceled wedding with Kiefer Sutherland, Julia Roberts was briefly linked to Jason Patric in 1991. The press followed the connection closely, often treating it as another chapter in the public drama surrounding the ceremony that had never taken place. Neither Julia nor Jason offered a detailed public account of the relationship, and it ended without becoming a lasting partnership. 2 years later, Julia made a very different trip toward marriage. On June 27, 1993, at 25, she entered St. James Lutheran Church in Marion, Indiana, and married country singer Lyle Lovett. The ceremony had been arranged in only 2 days. About 75 guests gathered inside the church, and Lovett's band played Angel Eyes for the bride. The contrast with June 1991 was impossible to miss. The earlier wedding had been planned for more than 500 guests inside a Hollywood soundstage, but the vows were never spoken. This ceremony was smaller, faster, and far removed from a studio production. Julia and Lyle stood before their guests and completed the promise. Julia later spoke warmly about her husband. "He's just wonderful," she said. "I couldn't be luckier or happier." The marriage also showed a side of her personal life that the canceled wedding had obscured. Despite the attention surrounding her, she was still willing to make a public commitment and begin another chapter. In March 1995, less than 2 years after the ceremony, Julia and Lyle announced their separation. They did so without public accusation or scandal, releasing a joint statement. "We remain close and in great support of one another." There were no children from the marriage, and neither offered a single public explanation that reduced the ending to one event. The small church had succeeded where the Hollywood soundstage had not. The bride arrived, the music played, and the vows were spoken. Yet the marriage still came to an end. Its importance did not depend on lasting forever. For a brief period, Julia and Lyle had chosen the same future and entered it sincerely. When that future changed, they ended the marriage with the same restraint that had marked its beginning. In 2000, while filming The Mexican, Julia Roberts met cinematographer Daniel Motter. Their relationship began under difficult circumstances because Daniel was still married at the time. Julia later described the situation as terribly complicated. acknowledging its difficulty without offering every private detail for public examination. Daniel's divorce was finalized in 2002, and he and Julia married on July 4 of that year at her ranch in Taos, New Mexico. Their family expanded in November 2004 with the birth of twins Hazel and Phineas. Their son Henry followed in June 2007. Julia had much of her adult life moving between film sets, premieres, interviews, and international attention. Raising 3 children introduced a different rhythm: school schedules, time away from work, family routines, and decisions that could not be measured by box office results. Julia later called the family she and Daniel created a dream come true. She also described returning to them after work as the best stuff. Acting remained an important part of her life, but parenthood changed how she chose projects and how long she was willing to remain away. Productions had to fit around responsibilities that continued after filming ended. Julia and Daniel maintained their relationship through habits that were largely ordinary. She has spoken about their practice of writing letters to each other, preserving affection and shared memories in their own words. The letters continued after marriage and parenthood, offering a personal record of years' experience together. Asked what consistently brought her joy, Julia answered simply, "Danny Mater never changes." By then, their relationship had continued through the births of 3 children, changing work schedules, professional travel, and the pressures that accompany a highly visible career. On July 4, 2026, Julia and Daniel marked 24 years of marriage. Hazel, Phineas, and Henry had grown into young adults, while their parents had moved through more than 2 decades of shared responsibilities. The marriage had not been sustained by one public declaration. It had continued through letters, family routines, professional adjustments, and the repeated work of raising 3 children together. 20 days after Nancy Moats died in February 2014, Julia Roberts still struggled to speak about the loss. Nancy was 37. In an interview conducted while the grief was still immediate, Julia called it just heartbreak and said that some days could only be endured hour by hour. The words did not offer resolution or attempt to turn sorrow into a lesson. They described grief at its most honest. A family continuing through time, while one of its members could no longer continue with them. The loss also entered a family history that the public had often described through conflict. For years, headlines portrayed Julia and her older brother Eric Roberts as estranged or involved in a lasting feud. Their different careers, Eric's past difficulties, and his own acknowledgement that he had once been exhausting to be around, gave those stories material to repeat. Yet the private reality was more complicated than a simple rivalry between siblings. Eric later described an important family moment in 2004, after Julia gave birth to twins Hazel and Phineas. He and his wife went to the hospital intending to leave gifts. Instead, they were invited inside. Eric remembered becoming awash in brotherly and unclely love. The meeting mattered because it was not staged as a public reconciliation. It was a brother entering a room, seeing his sister with her newborn children, and experiencing the connection that still existed between them. That moment did not prove that every disagreement had disappeared. It did show that the relationship could not be reduced to permanent silence. Families can carry affection and frustration at the same time. They can lose closeness during difficult years and still recognize one another when a door opens again. In 2026, Eric directly challenged the long-standing public description of a feud. He said that he and Julia had experienced the kinds of disagreements that occur within many families, but continued to love and respect one another. "We're not in a contest," he said. The statement rejected the idea that their careers had turned them into opponents, or that one sibling's success required the other's defeat. Seen together, Eric's accounts present a more human picture than the headlines allowed. There had been strain, difficult periods, and reasons for distance. There had also been hospital visits, affection, respect, and continued family ties. No single reunion erased everything that came before, and no single disagreement defined everything that followed. Nancy's death brought a different kind of absence. one that could not be negotiated, corrected, or softened through another conversation. Julia's words, "just heartbreak, and hour by hour," remain the clearest description of what that loss meant at the time. The family did not emerge from grief with every relationship perfectly repaired. It continued with its contradictions intact. Sorrow beside affection, history beside contact, and love surviving even when the public preferred a simpler story. One rare red carpet appearance revealed how quickly public attention could reach Julia Roberts' children. In 2021, 16-year-old Hazel Motter attended the Cannes Film Festival beside her father, Daniel. Photographs of her circulated widely, and public discussion quickly turned toward her resemblance to Julia and whether she might eventually enter the entertainment industry. Julia did not use the attention to promote her family as an extension of her career. She and Daniel had raised Hazel, Phineas, and Henry with a clear separation between their mother's profession and their own developing lives. "We try to protect our kids," Julia explained. "We just want to have our family life and not have that intruded upon." That protection did not require denying the reality of Julia's fame. Her children knew what she did and occasionally accompanied their parents to professional events. But appearances remained uncommon, and Julia resisted placing their childhoods into a continuing cycle of interviews, photographs, and publicity. The distinction mattered because young people born into famous families are often introduced through comparison before they have formed identities of their own. A daughter may be evaluated by how closely she resembles her mother. A son may be asked whether he will enter the same profession. Ordinary decisions can become public predictions about a future the child has not chosen. Julia and Daniel could not prevent every photograph or question. They could control how often their children were presented for attention and how much of family life became available for discussion. Hazel, Phineas, and Henry were given time to grow without being required to perform versions of themselves for strangers. By the time all three entered young adulthood, none had been turned into a permanent feature of Julia's public career. Their family name brought unavoidable curiosity, but their interests, relationships, and future choices remained largely theirs to define. Julia's protection was therefore practical rather than symbolic. Fewer appearances, clearer boundaries, and the freedom for each child to decide when and whether to step forward. Julia Roberts entered Hollywood without the confidence audiences later assumed had always belonged to her. "I don't think I entered into my career with much confidence," she once admitted, remembering an industry in which some people could be really cruel. The uncertain young actress eventually became one of the most recognizable women in American film. Years later, speaking about entering male-dominated rooms, she described the distance she had traveled in 4 words: "I am without fear." At 58, Julia continues choosing roles that allow greater complexity without requiring her to remain constantly visible. She can return to acting when a character interests her and step away when the work no longer justifies the time it demands. That freedom was earned through decades in which her performances, salary, relationships, and private decisions were repeatedly examined. Her public success was extraordinary. Pretty Woman made her America's sweetheart. Erin Brockovich brought an Academy Award and helped change the financial expectations placed upon leading actresses. Yet those victories existed beside losses no professional achievement could reverse. Her father died when she was 10. Her engagement to Kiefer Sutherland ended days before the wedding. Her first marriage did not last. In 2014, her half-sister Nancy died at 37. Julia could not rewrite those events. She could decide what followed them. With Daniel Motter, she sustained a marriage across more than 2 decades. Together, they raised Hazel, Phineas, and Henry while limiting how much of their family life became part of her celebrity. The separation between actress and mother was not absolute, but it was deliberate. The girl who had watched the shape of her childhood family change eventually became responsible for a family of her own. She could not restore the years her father never lived or remove every sorrow that entered the Roberts family. she could remain present for the years still available to her husband, to her children, and to the life continuing after the cameras were gone. An Academy Award recorded one professional triumph. The historic salary recorded another. Neither could measure the quieter achievement that took decades to build. Julia Roberts became famous for a smile the world believed it knew. Her deeper victory was building a life the world was never allowed to own. And perhaps that is why her story endures, not because life spared her from heartbreak, but because she learned how to protect what heartbreak could never take away. If Julia Roberts' journey has stayed with you, leave a few words of tribute below.